Eleanor's hands were steady as she changed the bandages, her weathered fingers moving with practiced precision. From where Laurel lay on the bed, those hands seemed like a sailor's, mapped with lines that told stories of resilience. Unlike Laurel's own hands that had once been steady with surgical instruments, but now trembled at the slightest provocation. "You're healing well," Eleanor said, her voice like rough velvet. "Better than last week." Laurel frowned. "Last week?" A shadow crossed Eleanor's face there and gone so quickly that Laurel might have imagined it. The older woman tucked the edges of the fresh bandage and stepped back. "How long have I been here?" Laurel asked, the familiar sense of dread building in her chest. 34 days, Eleanor answered, not meeting her eyes. "That's impossible." Laurel tried to sit up, ignoring the sharp pain in her side. "I just arrived yesterday, or the day before." Eleanor sighed, a sound heavy with repetition, and moved to the window, pulling back the thick curtains to let in the pale morning light. Outside, snow blanketed the rolling landscape that stretched toward distant mountains. "This is Shadow Creek Ranch," Eleanor said, as if reciting from memory. "My brother Thaddeus found you in Desolation Valley during the first winter storm. You were half frozen, abandoned. That was 34 days ago." She turned from the window. "Today is February 12th, 1869, and we've had this conversation 17 times before." The weight of those words settled on Laurel's chest like a stone. "I don't understand," she whispered, though part of her did. Part of her recognized the familiar contours of this room, the patchwork quilt, the rocking chair by the window, the small table with its collection of dried wildflowers in a blue ceramic vase. Eleanor's expression softened. "Your memory comes and goes, Doctor. Matthew says it's from the cold and from—" She hesitated. "What happened to you before?" Flashes of memory threatened at the edges of Laurel's consciousness. Angry voices, the crack of a wooden door splintering, rough hands dragging her through snow. She pushed them away. "Where is—" She fumbled for the name that was both familiar and strange. "Thaddeus. Checking the north pasture. He'll be back by sundown." Eleanor collected her medical supplies. "Your journal is in the drawer. It might help like it has before." After Eleanor left, Laurel sat in silence, listening to the unfamiliar creak of this house that was supposedly her home of 34 days. With trembling fingers, she pulled open the bedside drawer and found a leather-bound journal, its spine cracked from use. The first entry was dated January 9th, 1869. "I don't know if I should trust these people, but I have little choice. The man who found me, Thaddeus Kane, has the eyes of someone who has seen war. I recognize that look. I wore it myself after Antietam." Laurel's breath caught. Antietam. The name sent a cascade of images through her mind. Blood-soaked fields, screaming men with mangled limbs, her own hands working frantically to stem the tide of death. She continued reading each entry, revealing fragments of a life she couldn't remember living. According to the journal, she was Laurel Blackwood, widow of Dr. Edwin Blackwood and former Army nurse during the Civil War. She had come west after Edwin's death, settling in the religious community of Providence Valley, where her medical knowledge had been viewed with suspicion. March 3rd, Elder Caldwell suggested again that I should marry his son Isaiah. I refused. "A widow with knowledge is dangerous," he says. "I wonder if he knows how dangerous I really am." And then the final entry before a gap of several weeks, March 20th. "They're watching my cabin. I've barricaded the door, but I don't think it will hold. If you're reading this, know that Providence Valley isn't what it seems. Elder Caldwell and the others hide behind scripture, but their hearts are black with—" The entry ended abruptly. The next page had been torn, leaving only ragged edges. After the gap, a new entry appeared in handwriting she recognized as her own, but with a shakiness to the letters. January 10th. "Eleanor showed me this journal today. She says I've been at Shadow Creek Ranch for 2 days. I don't remember arriving. The last thing I recall is snow. So much snow." The entries continued, each one a variation of the same realization that she had been at Shadow Creek Ranch for 3 days, then 12, that she kept forgetting, that she kept having to relearn her own story. Laurel closed the journal, her head throbbing with half-formed memories and questions. She looked around the room, her room apparently, and noticed details she had missed before. A small collection of dried herbs hanging by the window, a worn medical text on the shelf, a gray woolen shawl draped over the chair that seemed familiar to her touch when she reached for it. With effort, she rose from the bed and crossed to the window. The ranch spread out below, a collection of sturdy buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by snow-covered pastures and pine forests. In the distance, dark clouds gathered over jagged peaks. Desolation Valley, she supposed, where Thaddeus Kane had found her dying in the snow. The movement caught her eye, a rider approaching from the east, his broad shoulders set against the wind. Something about his silhouette sent a jolt of recognition through her. Without knowing why, Laurel's heart began to race. Thaddeus Kane had learned long ago to read the land like others read books. The gathering clouds over the eastern ridge meant another storm within 2 days. The way the cattle clustered near the South Creek suggested the water was still flowing despite the cold. The single set of unfamiliar hoof prints crossing his property whispered of a visitor who didn't want to be noticed. He nudged his horse toward the home, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Since bringing the woman Laurel back to Shadow Creek, he'd felt eyes watching the ranch. Nothing he could prove, just a prickling sense of danger that had kept him alive during the war. The main house came into view, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Through the upstairs window, he caught a glimpse of movement, a figure silhouetted against the glass. So she was, up and about today. That was progress. By the time he reached the stables, Marcus was waiting to take his horse. Riders passed by the north fence line. The ranch hand reported his breath fogging in the cold air. 3 men keeping their distance. Thaddeus nodded. Same as Tuesday. Same direction, coming from Providence Valley, I'd wager. Double the night watch, Thaddeus said, removing his saddlebags. And quietly, I don't want to alarm the household. Marcus glanced toward the main house. How is she today? I'll find out. Thaddeus clapped the younger man on the shoulder. Keep your rifle close, Marcus. Inside the house was warm and smelled of Eleanor's cooking. His sister met him in the hallway, her expression warning him before she spoke. She's awake, Eleanor said softly. It's a fresh start again. Thaddeus removed his hat and coat, shaking off the snow. Did you show her the journal? I did. She's been quiet since. Eleanor took his coat, her movements efficient as always. She asked about you. By name. Yes, that's new. Eleanor's eyes, so like their father's, studied him carefully. What will you tell her this time? Thaddeus ran a hand through his graying hair. The truth, as much as she can bear. Eleanor's expression softened. She's stronger than she looks, Thad. She survived Desolation Valley in a blizzard. She survived whatever those Providence people did to her before that. I know, he said, though part of him wanted to protect Laurel from her own memories. He'd seen men after battle who couldn't recall the horrors they'd witnessed. Sometimes forgetting was the mind's way of healing. She should eat, Eleanor said, returning to practical matters. I've made stew. Upstairs, Thaddeus paused outside Laurel's door, composing himself before knocking softly. Come in, called a voice that had become familiar despite its intermittent presence in his home. Laurel stood by the window, her slender frame wrapped in the gray shawl Eleanor had knitted for her. The fading light caught in her auburn hair, illuminating strands of premature silver. She turned as he entered, her green eyes wary but not fearful. You're Thaddeus Kane, she said, the statement both a question and an answer. I am. He remained by the door, giving her space. How are you feeling today, Mrs. Blackwood? Confused, she admitted. I read the journal, but it's like reading about someone else's life. Her gaze was direct, challenging. You found me in Desolation Valley. Yes. Why were you there? That valley is miles from the main trail. It was a new question. In previous awakenings, she had asked about Providence Valley, about how long she would stay, about whether anyone was looking for her. Never about why he had been riding through a remote valley during a blizzard. My horse, he said after a moment. Dusk has good instincts. He refused the main trail that day. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie. She studied him, the nurse's analytical gaze that could strip away pretense. You were a soldier. Yes. Confederate, she said, not a question this time. Thaddeus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Yes. I was a Union nurse. Her chin lifted slightly. We were enemies. The war is over, Mrs. Blackwood. Is it? Her gaze drifted back to the window, to the distant mountains. I still hear the screams sometimes. Still smell the blood and rot. Still see boys younger than my brother dying under my hands. She glanced back at him. Does it ever go away for you? The question caught him off guard. None of her previous awakenings had delved into the war. They stood in silence, 2 survivors connected by shared ghosts. No, he finally answered. It doesn't go away. but it gets quieter. Something in her expression shifted, not quite trust, but recognition. She nodded once. Eleanor has made stew, he said, changing the subject. You should eat. Build your strength. For what purpose? The question was soft but pointed. To heal, he said simply. To remember if that's what you want. And if I don't want to remember, her voice had a fragility that belied her straight posture. Thaddeus thought of the torn pages in her journal of the bruises that had marked her body when he found her of the name she sometimes cried out in her fever dreams. Then Shadow Creek will remain your sanctuary for as long as you need, he promised. The dining room was warm with firelight and the rich aroma of Eleanor's cooking. Laurel sat stiffly at the table, acutely aware of being an outsider in this family ritual. Eleanor served the stew with fresh bread while Thaddeus poured water from a heavy pitcher. Do you remember yesterday at all? Eleanor asked as they began to eat. Laurel shook her head. Nothing since Providence Valley. And even that's, she made a vague gesture, fragmented. You helped me organize the medicinal herbs, Eleanor said. You knew their properties better than I did. Said it was from your nursing days. Laurel looked down at her hands. They seemed foreign to her now, but she could almost feel the phantom weight of bandages, the slickness of blood. You were at Antietam, Thaddeus said quietly. Yes. The battlefield materialized in her mind, the cornfield where so many had fallen, the blood turning the Potomac's tributaries red. And Gettysburg after. That's where my husband died. The words felt rehearsed as if she'd recited this story many times before. Perhaps she had in these awakenings she couldn't remember. He was a doctor, Eleanor prompted, a surgeon, brilliant, innovative. Laurel took a sip of water, her throat suddenly dry. He believed medicine should evolve, that we shouldn't be bound by outdated practices just because that's how things had always been done. She didn't mention the arguments this had caused, how Edwin's methods had been viewed as controversial, even heretical by some, how he had pushed boundaries that perhaps should have remained intact. And after the war, you came west, Thaddeus said, guiding the conversation forward. Yes, Laurel frowned, trying to piece together the fragmented memories. I couldn't stay in the east. Too many ghosts. I had a brother in Colorado, but I never made it that far. She looked up. I stopped in Providence Valley because their advertisement said they needed a midwife. Eleanor and Thaddeus exchanged a glance. What? Laurel asked, noticing. Providence Valley doesn't welcome outsiders easily, Eleanor said carefully, especially women with independent ideas. Elder Caldwell, Laurel said, the name rising from her memory like a specter. He's the leader there. Yes, Thaddeus confirmed, his expression neutral. A man of strong convictions. He wanted me to marry his son. Laurel's hand tightened around her spoon. Isaiah, a weak man with cruel eyes. Images flashed through her mind, a young man with a sharp face and hands that moved too quickly, a woman with bruises she claimed came from falling children who flinched at sudden movements. I refused, she continued, the memories becoming clearer as she spoke. That's when things changed. They started watching my cabin. The women stopped coming for treatment, and then the memories hit a wall, dissolving into confusion and fragments of terror. Then they came for you, Thaddeus finished quietly. Laurel looked up, meeting his gaze. How do you know that? Your journal mentioned it. And when I found you in Desolation Valley, you weren't dressed for travel. No horse, no supplies, just your wedding ring and that journal tucked inside your coat. He paused. People don't wander into Desolation Valley by accident, especially not during a storm. A chill ran through Laurel that had nothing to do with the winter outside. They left me to die. She whispered, the realization both shocking and somehow not surprising. It appears so, Eleanor said gently. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Laurel stared into the flames, trying to process this revelation. She had been abandoned to the elements, left to freeze to death by people who claimed to serve a loving God. Why help me? She finally asked, looking at Thaddeus. A union nurse, a stranger, a woman with independent ideas. His expression remained steady. You needed help. It's not that simple. Sometimes it is. Eleanor cleared her throat. Thaddeus has his own history with Providence Valley, she said, ignoring her brother's warning look. Our sister Rebecca married a man from there. Eleanor, Thaddeus said quietly, she should know Thad. Eleanor turned back to Laurel. Rebecca died 3 years ago, supposedly an accident, but we don't know what happened, Thaddeus interrupted firmly. Only that she was unhappy in her marriage, and then she was gone. The pieces began to align in Laurel's mind. That's why you were in Desolation Valley, she said. You were watching Providence. Thaddeus's silence was confirmation enough. I'm sorry about your sister, Laurel said softly. So am I, Eleanor replied. But perhaps her death served a purpose if it meant Thaddeus was there to find you. After dinner, Eleanor showed Laurel to a small sitting room off the main hallway. This might help with your memory, she said, opening the door. Inside, Laurel found a makeshift clinic, a narrow bed shelves of medical supplies, a cabinet with herbs and tinctures. A familiar medical bag sat on a small desk. My supplies, Laurel breathed, running her fingers over the worn leather. Thaddeus went back to your cabin after the snow cleared, Eleanor explained. Got there before the Providence people could claim your things. Laurel opened the bag, finding her instruments still in perfect order, scalpels, forceps, stethoscope, and all arranged exactly as she preferred. The familiarity of them brought a lump to her throat. You've been using this room on your better days, Eleanor continued, organizing supplies, preparing medicines. You seemed at peace here. Laurel nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her chest. This room represented who she had been before, competent, purposeful, defined by more than her trauma and fractured memory. I'll leave you to it, Eleanor said, sensing Laurel's need for solitude. Alone, Laurel explored the small clinic. Her fingers moved instinctively among the herbs, identifying each by touch and smell: yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, foxglove for heart ailments. She opened a journal on the desk, finding notes in her own handwriting, observations about treatments and medicinal preparations. One entry caught her attention. Feb 3T still coughs at night, though he hides it. Prepared elderberry and thyme tincture. Left it by his bed while E distracted him. Stubborn man won't admit he needs help. Laurel smiled despite herself. She could imagine Thaddeus Kane refusing treatment, too proud or too stoic to acknowledge weakness. As she continued exploring, she discovered a locked cabinet tucked in the corner. The key wasn't immediately visible, and something about the cabinet's plain, unassuming appearance piqued her curiosity. What would need to be locked away in a house where she was supposedly welcome? A noise from the hallway drew her attention. Through the partially open door, she glimpsed Thaddeus walking toward the back of the house, his expression troubled. He carried what looked like a medical bag, not her own, but similar, and disappeared down a corridor Laurel hadn't yet explored. She hesitated only briefly before following, keeping her footsteps light on the wooden floors. The hallway led to a part of the house that felt different, colder, less lived in. At its end stood a heavy oak door, which Thaddeus unlocked with a key from his pocket. He entered, closing the door behind him. Laurel approached, slowly aware that she was intruding, but driven by an instinct she couldn't name. Through the keyhole, she could see little, just Thaddeus moving around what appeared to be a room filled with books and papers. He set the medical bag on a table and opened it, removing vials of liquid and what looked like surgical instruments. She pulled back, heart racing with questions. Why would Thaddeus Kane, rancher and former Confederate soldier, have a hidden room filled with medical equipment? What was he doing that required such secrecy? As she turned to retreat, her foot caught on a loose floorboard, causing a barely audible creak. Inside the room, movement stopped. Laurel froze, holding her breath. After a moment, footsteps approached the door. She backed away quickly, looking for somewhere to hide, but the hallway offered no refuge. The door opened, and Thaddeus stood framed in the doorway, his expression unreadable, as he found her standing there. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice carefully neutral. I was exploring, she said, opting for honesty. I saw you come this way. He studied her, clearly weighing how much to reveal. This is a private room. With medical supplies, she challenged. A muscle tightened in his jaw. Yes. Are you ill? She asked, though she suspected that wasn't it. No. Then what? Some things are best left alone, Mrs. Blackwood, he interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. For your safety as well as others. The warning was clear, but it only heightened her curiosity. What was in that room that could pose a danger to her? Or was the danger in the knowing itself? I understand privacy, she said carefully. I was a nurse. Patient confidentiality was sacred. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition perhaps, or a new assessment. It's late, he said finally. You should rest. Your memory. Tomorrow may be difficult again. The reminder of her fragile mind stung, but she recognized the deflection for what it was. "Good night, Mr. Kane," she said, conceding this battle, but not the war. As she walked back toward her room, Laurel felt more alert than she had since awakening. The mystery of Thaddeus Kane's secret room had awakened the analytical part of her mind, the part that had made her an effective nurse that had survived battlefields and grief. Whatever he was hiding, she would discover it, and perhaps in doing so, she would discover more of herself as well. That night, Laurel dreamed of snow and darkness. In the dream, she wandered through Desolation Valley, calling a name she couldn't quite remember when awake. The snow swirled around her, beautiful and deadly, obscuring her path and muffling her cries. From the darkness, figures watched Elder Caldwell with his Bible clutched like a weapon, Isaiah with his cruel, hungry eyes. Women from Providence Valley who had once sought her healing hands but now turned away in fear. Heretic, they called her. Unnatural woman. She ran, but the snow dragged at her feet. Behind her, torches flickered as the mob gave chase. Ahead, only darkness and deeper snow, the promise of a cold, anonymous death. Then, cutting through the howling wind, a voice called her name. Not Laurel, but another name, one that resonated in her bones. She turned toward it, seeing a silhouette against the storm, a man on horseback, arm extended toward her. "I found you," he said, and for a moment she thought it was Edwin. But when she reached for him, Thaddeus Kane's face emerged from the shadows, his eyes reflecting the same horrors she carried within her own soul. "I found you," he repeated, "but you're still lost." Laurel woke with a grunt, the dream clinging to her like cobwebs. Outside her window, the moon cut through breaking clouds, casting silver light across the ranch. In that otherworldly illumination, Shadow Creek looked almost spectral, a place caught between reality and dream. Unable to return to sleep, she wrapped herself in the gray shawl and moved quietly downstairs. The house was silent except for the occasional settling of old wood. She found her way to the front porch, easing the door open and stepping into the cold night air. The world was transformed by moonlight and snow, familiar shapes rendered strange and beautiful. Laurel sat on the porch steps, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. The cold was bracing, clearing her mind of lingering dream fragments. "Couldn't sleep?" a voice asked from the shadows. Laurel started turning to find Thaddeus seated in a dark corner of the porch, a rifle across his knees. "I didn't see you," she said, her pulse gradually slowing. Force of habit. He remained still, his face half illuminated by moonlight. "Keeping watch. For Providence Valley people, among others." Laurel looked out at the snow-covered landscape. "They won't let me go, will they? They tried to kill me once. They'll try again." "Probably," he acknowledged, his honesty oddly comforting after so much confusion. "Why, what could I possibly threaten?" Thaddeus was silent for a long moment. "Control," he finally said. "Men like Elder Caldwell maintain power by controlling what people believe, how they think. Someone like you, educated, independent questioning, you're a crack in the foundation." "I just wanted to help," she whispered. "To use what I learned in the war to ease suffering." "I know." They sat in silence, two insomniacs under a winter moon. Despite the circumstances, Laurel felt a curious peace in his presence, a recognition of shared burdens. "In the war," she said after a while, "I treated men from both sides. When they came to my table, they weren't Union or Confederate. They were just broken bodies needing mending." "Compassion doesn't recognize uniforms," Thaddeus agreed. "Oh, no." She studied his profile, noting the lines etched around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. "What regiment?" "3rd Virginia Cavalry." "You were at Chancellorsville," she said, remembering the waves of wounded from that battle. "Yes." "And Gettysburg." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. "3rd day, Pickett's charge." Laurel closed her eyes briefly. Pickett's charge, one of the most devastating military miscalculations in the war. Thousands of Confederate soldiers sent across open fields under Union artillery fire. A slaughter. "You survived," she said, not a question, but a recognition of the statistical miracle of his presence. "Not all of me." His hand moved unconsciously to his left side, where Laurel suspected a wound lay hidden beneath layers of clothing. "Mr. Kane," she began, but he interrupted gently. "Thaddeus, please." "Thaddeus," she amended, "whatever you're hiding in that room, does it have to do with Providence Valley, with what happened to your sister?" His silence was heavy with unspoken truths. "I want to remember," Laurel said, her voice strengthening with resolve. "I need to know what happened to me there, why they decided I had to die." "And if remembering breaks something inside you," he asked quietly. "I've seen it happen. Men who recall the battle and lose themselves in the memory. I've already been broken, she replied. By war, by loss, by whatever Providence Valley did to me. At least with memory I might forge those broken pieces into something useful. Thaddeus turned to look at her fully, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. There's a strength in you, Mrs. Blackwood. Laurel, she said. If I'm to call you Thaddeus, then I am Laurel to you. He nodded once. Laurel. The sound of her name in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her, a reminder that she was more than a collection of fragments and lost memories. She was Laurel, a woman with a name and a history, even if parts of that history remained shrouded in darkness. Tomorrow, Thaddeus said, his voice low and measured, if you remember this conversation, come find me at the stables. There are things you should know, things that might help you understand. And if I don't remember? His smile was small but genuine. Then we'll have this conversation again, in another time, another awakening. The moon slipped behind clouds, casting the porch into deeper shadow. In that moment of darkness, Laurel felt the curious sensation of standing on a threshold between forgetting and remembering, between fear and resolve, between the woman she had been and the one she might become. I'll remember, she promised, as much to herself as to him. Morning brought heavy snow and an unexpected clarity to Laurel's mind. She woke remembering not only the previous day, but the night conversation with Thaddeus as well. Progress perhaps, or simply a temporary reprieve from the fog that had claimed so many of her days. Eleanor seemed surprised when Laurel referenced their dinner conversation. You remember, she said, pausing in the act of pouring coffee. Everything since yesterday morning, Laurel confirmed. Is that unusual? 2 consecutive days is promising. Eleanor's expression brightened. Dr. Matthews said consistency might return gradually. This could be the beginning. After breakfast, Laurel wrapped herself in a heavy coat borrowed from Eleanor and made her way to the stables, following Thaddeus's instructions from the night before. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, muffling the world in white silence. The stable was warm and fragrant with the smell of hay and horses. Thaddeus stood in the center aisle, brushing a large black gelding whose intelligent eyes tracked Laurel's approach. You remembered, he said, not turning from his task. I did. She approached cautiously, mindful of the large animal. Is that Dusk, the horse who brought you to Desolation Valley? Yes, he ran a hand along the horse's neck. He has good instincts about people. As if in response, Dusk extended his nose toward Laurel, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. May I? She asked, gesturing toward the horse. Thaddeus nodded, and Laurel gently placed her hand on the gelding's forehead, feeling the warmth of him, the steady life force beneath her palm. Dusk leaned into her touch, a gesture that brought an unexpected smile to her face. He approves. Thaddeus said something like satisfaction in his voice. I'm honored. She stroked the horse's velvet nose. You said there were things I should know. Thaddeus set the brush aside and moved to a wooden trunk pushed against the wall. From it, he withdrew a wrapped bundle and brought it to Laurel. These were with your medical supplies, he said. I didn't show them to you before because I wasn't sure what they would trigger. Laurel unwrapped the bundle with careful fingers, finding a collection of papers in a small, leather-bound book that wasn't her journal. The book's cover bore no title, but when she opened it, she recognized Edwin's handwriting, immediately precise and slanted, the penmanship of a surgeon. Edwin's research notebook, she breathed, running her fingers over the familiar script. How did you know it was important? I didn't, Thaddeus admitted, but medical texts were the only things taken from your cabin. Everything else was left untouched. That suggested they held significance. Laurel nodded, leafing through the pages filled with Edwin's observations and theories. Many of the entries documented experimental treatments he had developed during the war, innovations born of necessity and scarce supplies. Others contained diagrams of surgical techniques that had scandalized more traditional doctors. Edwin believed medicine should evolve, she said softly. That tradition alone wasn't sufficient reason to continue practices that failed patients. A dangerous philosophy in a place like Providence Valley, Thaddeus observed. Yes. Laurel continued, turning pages, pausing when she reached entries she didn't recognize. The handwriting was still Edwin's, but the dates were after his supposed death at Gettysburg. This isn't possible, she whispered. What is it? Thaddeus moved closer, looking over her shoulder at the notebook. These entries, they're dated after Edwin died. Her finger traced the date at the top of the page. October 1864, but Edwin died in July 1863. Thaddeus's expression remained neutral, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Are you certain of the date of his death? Of course I'm certain, Laurel said sharply. I identified his body myself. He was brought to my field hospital after the battle. But even as she spoke, doubt crept in. The memories of that day were chaotic, hundreds of wounded. The overwhelming stench of blood and death, her own exhaustion after 3 days without sleep. She looked back at the notebook at the familiar handwriting that couldn't possibly exist after Edwin's death. Unless he survived. She whispered the realization both impossible and undeniable. It would appear so, Thaddeus said quietly. Laurel felt the ground shift beneath her reality, realigning itself around this new truth. If Edwin had survived Gettysburg, why had he let her believe he was dead? Where had he gone, and how had his research notebook ended up in her possession in Providence Valley? With trembling hands, she turned to the last entry in the book, dated November 1866. Providence Valley provides the isolation needed for the final phases of research. Elder Caldwell remains suspicious but is kept in check by Gideon's influence. The treatments are showing promise, though side effects persist. L would disapprove of my methods, but she always did place too much emphasis on conventional ethics. Some boundaries must be crossed for true progress. L would disapprove. L. Laurel, her husband, had been alive, continuing his research in secret, and he had thought of her as a constraint on his work. What's wrong? Thaddeus asked, noticing her distress. Edwin, she said, her voice hollow. He was in Providence Valley recently. She looked up, meeting Thaddeus's gaze. Did you know? No, Theo. He answered, the simple denial carrying the weight of truth. But it explained some things. What things? Instead of answering directly, Thaddeus gestured to the papers that had been wrapped with the notebook. Look at these. Laurel set Edwin's notebook aside and examined the papers. They were medical records, patients treated for unusual symptoms, memory loss, disorientation, unexplained fevers, seizures. All residents of Providence Valley, all seen by a Dr. Ward. I don't understand, she said, looking up at Thaddeus. These were hidden in your clinic in Providence Valley, he explained. Along with this. He handed her a small vial containing a few drops of amber liquid. Laurel uncorked it carefully, detecting the faint aroma of herbs and chemicals. Something about the scent triggered a memory. Edwin working late in their small apartment in Philadelphia before the war, mixing tinctures with an almost feverish intensity. This is Edwin's work, she said with certainty. His experimental treatments. For what purpose? Laurel shook her head. He was researching ways to treat brain injuries, trauma. The war gave him subjects. She couldn't keep the distaste from her voice. Edwin's dedication to science had sometimes overshadowed his compassion. But these records, these patients, they weren't soldiers with battle wounds. No, Thaddeus agreed. They were ordinary people from Providence Valley. The implications settled over Laurel like a shroud. Her husband, presumed dead, had been alive and continuing his research in Providence Valley. Had her arrival there been coincidence? Or had Edwin known she was coming? Had she been meant to find these records? There's something else, Thaddeus said, his voice gentle but firm. Something you need to see. He led her from the stables back toward the house, not to the main entrance, but to a side door that opened onto a narrow staircase. At the top of the stairs lay the hallway with the mysterious locked room Laurel had discovered the night before. Thaddeus withdrew the key from his pocket. What do you see in here must remain between us, he said, his expression grave. Eleanor doesn't even know the full truth. I understand, Laurel said, though anticipation and dread battled within her. The room beyond the door was larger than it had appeared through the keyhole, a combination of study and medical facility. Bookshelves lined one wall filled with medical texts and journals. A large desk occupied the center, covered with papers and anatomical drawings. Along another wall stood a narrow bed and, beside it, medical equipment that would not have been out of place in a modern hospital. But it was the figure in the bed that drew Laurel's attention, a young woman, perhaps 20, lying still with eyes closed. Her breathing was shallow but regular, her complexion pallid. This is Hannah, Thaddeus said quietly. My sister Rebecca's daughter, my niece. Laurel approached the bed, her nurse's instincts taking over as she assessed the patient. What happened to her? She appeared at Shadow Creek 3 months ago, barely conscious. She'd escaped from Providence Valley where she'd been living with her father after Rebecca died. Thaddeus's voice remained steady, But Laurel detected the undercurrent of fury beneath his calm. She had been experimented on. By whom, Laurel asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. A doctor who arrived in the valley after the war. He called himself Gideon Ward, the name from Edwin's notebook. Laurel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. But you suspect it was Edwin, she said, meeting Thaddeus's gaze. I don't know, he admitted. The descriptions don't match your husband's appearance, but men can change. What I do know is that Ward continued the work referenced in that notebook, experimental treatments focused on memory and mental control. Laurel turned back to Hannah, gently checking her pulse. And she was one of his subjects. Yes, though it seems the treatment went wrong in her case. She has moments of lucidity, but they're brief. Most of the time, she exists in this twilight state, physically present but mentally elsewhere. The clinical part of Laurel's mind cataloged symptoms and potential treatments, while another part recoiled at the idea that her Edwin could be responsible for such suffering. The treatments you've been giving her, Laurel said, noticing the medical setup. What are they throwing? Palliative mostly, Thaddeus replied. I'm no doctor. I've been trying to wean her off whatever they gave her in Providence Valley, but without knowing exactly what it was. Oh, that's why you brought me here, Laurel realizes. Not just out of compassion, but because you hoped I might help Hannah. Thaddeus didn't deny it. I recognized your name when I found your journal. Laurel Blackwood, wife of Dr. Edwin Blackwood. I had heard rumors of a brilliant but controversial surgeon whose work focused on the brain. When I realized who you were, he shrugged, not needing to complete the thought. You hoped I might know how to reverse what was done to her, Laurel finished. Yes. Laurel looked down at Hannah, at the young face unmarked by lines of worry or joy, a life interrupted before it had truly begun. She thought of Edwin's notebook, of the experimental treatments he had pursued with such single-minded focus. I don't know if I can help her, she admitted. Edwin never shared the details of his research with me. He said it was better if I didn't know everything, that my conscience might interfere with progress. But you're a nurse, Thaddeus said. You worked alongside him. You must have observed his methods. Some, she conceded, but he became more secretive after Antietam. The failures affected him deeply. He began working alone late into the night. She looked up at Thaddeus, seeing the hope in his eyes, despite his attempt to hide it. I'll do what I can for Hannah, but I need to understand more about what happened in Providence Valley. About what happened to me there. Thaddeus nodded, accepting the condition. I've been trying to piece it together, from what Hannah said during her lucid moments, and from what I observed while watching the Valley Ward, or Edwin has been conducting experiments for at least 2 years. Elder Caldwell allows it because Ward promised to help control the more rebellious elements of the community. Like women who question authority, Laurel said bitterly. Yes, but your arrival complicated things. Hannah recognized your name. She tried to warn you, I think, and that made you dangerous. Laurel frowned, trying to recall any young woman who had tried to approach her in Providence Valley. Her memories were still fragmentary, more impression than detail. I don't remember her, she admitted. She remembered you, Thaddeus said. When she heard your name, she became agitated, said you were kind to her during the treatments. A flash of memory, a young woman with frightened eyes strapped to a table. Laurel adjusting the restraints to prevent chafing, murmuring reassurances. Another doctor, not Edwin, someone older with silver at his temples, watching with cold approval. I was there, Laurel whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. I assisted with the treatments, but how I only arrived in Providence Valley in March. Perhaps earlier than you remember, Thaddeus suggested. Laurel shook her head, trying to reconcile these conflicting memories. But why would I forget? Why would I? She stopped, another piece falling into place. They used the treatment on me, she said slowly. When I discovered what was happening, they used Edwin's method to make me forget. Thaddeus nodded, the confirmation she both sought and dreaded. That's what Hannah said, that you found Ward's records, threatened to expose him. They held you down and injected you with something. After that, you were different, confused, compliant. Until I wasn't, Laurel concluded, until something triggered memories they wanted buried. Hannah said you started asking questions about missing women, about experiments. That's when they decided you couldn't be controlled and had to be eliminated. The pieces aligned, forming a picture that made terrible sense. Laurel looked down at her hands, hands that had healed and hands that unwittingly had caused harm. hands that had been instruments in her husband's morally questionable research. I need to go back, she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. To Providence Valley. Thaddeus's expression hardened. That would be suicide. I need answers, she insisted, and Hannah needs proper treatment. The key to both lies in Providence Valley in Edwin's research. They'll kill you the moment they recognize you. Not if they don't see me coming. Laurel met his gaze steadily. I was Union intelligence during the war before I was a nurse. I know how to move undetected. Surprise flickered across Thaddeus's face. You never mentioned that. It wasn't relevant to my nursing duties, she said, but it's relevant now. He studied her, weighing her determination against the very real danger. It's not just your safety I'm concerned about, he finally said. Your memories are still fragile. What happens if you return to Providence Valley and the trauma triggers another episode of forgetting? You could wander into their hands without even recognizing the danger. It was a valid concern. Laurel looked back at Hannah, at the stillness of her face, the only movement, the shallow rise and fall of her chest. I have to try, she said softly, for her, for the other women who might be suffering under Ward's experiments. And she hesitated, then committed to the truth, for myself. I need to know what role I played in all this. Whether willingly or unwillingly, I was part of it. Thaddeus was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a sound of resignation and resolve. Not alone, he said. If you're determined to go, I'm going with you. Laurel opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. The determination in his eyes matched her own. This wasn't just about her quest for answers, or even about Hannah. For Thaddeus, this was about Rebecca, about justice too long delayed. All right, she agreed, together. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But within that locked room, secrets had been unearthed that could never be buried again. Truths about Edwin, about Providence Valley, and about Laurel herself. Truths that would change everything. The storm was coming, both literally and figuratively. But for the first time since awakening at Shadow Creek Ranch, Laurel felt ready to face it. Not because her memory had fully returned, or because she had all the answers, but because she was no longer alone in her search for truth. She looked at Thaddeus, at the quiet strength in his stance, the unwavering resolve in his eyes. They were still strangers in many ways, divided by war and circumstance. But they were united now in purpose, in a quest for justice that transcended their differences. When do we leave? She asked. After the storm breaks, he replied. 2 days, perhaps 3. Laurel nodded, turning back to Hannah. She laid a gentle hand on the young woman's forehead. Hold on, she whispered. We're going to find answers. We're going to bring you back. Whether Hannah heard or understood, Laurel couldn't know. But making the promise aloud solidified her resolve. Whatever Edwin had become, whatever role she had played in his work, she would set it right. Not for redemption, some sins might be beyond forgiveness, but because it was the only path forward that she could live with. The past might be fractured, a puzzle with missing pieces, but the future was still unwritten. And Laurel was determined to write it with her own hand in ink that could not be erased by any of Edwin's experimental treatments. She was Laurel Blackwood, nurse spy survivor, and she would remember. The storm held Shadow Creek Ranch in its grip for 3 days. Snow piled in drifts against the buildings, and wind howled through the pines like lost souls seeking shelter. Laurel used the enforced isolation to prepare, dividing her time between Hannah's bedside and Edwin's research notebook. The notebook yielded disturbing insights. Edwin's early work had focused on treating soldiers with head injuries and battle trauma, noble enough in its intent. But as the war progressed, his focus shifted. He became obsessed with memory itself, how it formed, how it could be manipulated, how it might be selectively erased. May 15, 1863, Subject 17 shows promising response to the compound. Recalled nothing of the artillery barrage that killed his companions, though other memories remain intact. Selective erasure is possible, though precision remains elusive. 2 months before his supposed death at Gettysburg. Laurel remembered that period, Edwin growing distant, working late into the night, his excitement when breakthrough came. She had attributed his behavior to the pressures of war, to the desperate need to save shattered men. Now she wondered if there had been something darker, driving him, a fascination with control that transcended healing. The later entries, those written after his death, showed a progression that chilled her. No longer was he treating wounded soldiers. His subjects were civilians from Providence Valley, and his techniques had become more invasive. February 12, 1867, the neural pathway manipulation continues to show promise. Subject responds to suggestion without resistance. Memory consolidation can be interrupted with precise timing of the compound. Elder C remains supportive, having witnessed the potential applications for maintaining community harmony. Community harmony, a euphemism for control for silencing dissent. Laurel closed the notebook, unable to reconcile this version of Edwin with the idealistic doctor she had married. Had he always harbored these tendencies? Had she been blind to them, or had the war changed him, as it had changed so many? On the evening of the third day, when the storm finally abated, leaving the world crystalline and silent, Thaddeus found her in Hannah's room. Laurel had been reading aloud from a book of poetry, though whether Hannah could hear or comprehend remained unknown. "The storm's past," Thaddeus said from the doorway. "We can leave at first light." Laurel marked her place in the book and set it aside. "I've been studying Edwin's notes. His treatments involve a compound that inhibits memory consolidation combined with suggestion during a vulnerable mental state." She looked up at Thaddeus. "It's primitive but effective. Can it be reversed?" "Possibly." She gestured to the vial they had found among her belongings. "This contains a stabilizing agent that might counteract the memory disruption." Edwin was developing it as a way to control the process more precisely. "You want to try it on Hannah?" Thaddeus said, not a question. "It could help her." Laurel chose her words carefully. "Or it could make things worse. The compound is experimental and without knowing exactly what they gave her." "It's a risk either way," he finished. "Leave her as she is, or try something that might help or harm." "Yes." Thaddeus moved to Hannah's bedside, studying his niece's pale face. In the lamplight, the family resemblance was clear. The same strong brow, the same determined set to the jaw, even in repose. "What would you do?" he asked, his voice low. "If it were your family," Laurel considered the question, weighing medical ethics against the reality of their situation. "I would want to try," she finally said. "But I would want to know all the risks first." He nodded once decision made. "Tell me the risks." "The compound could cause seizures, permanent memory loss, or—" She hesitated. "Death. Edwin's notes indicate several subjects who reacted badly. And if we do nothing, she remains as she is, or gradually deteriorates." Thaddeus was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision evident in the tension of his shoulders, the furrow between his brows. "She was always brave," he said quietly, "even as a child, fearless. Rebecca used to say that girl would ride into hell itself if she thought something needed doing there." He looked up, meeting Laurel's gaze. "She wouldn't want to exist like this, trapped between worlds." "I'll prepare the treatment," Laurel said. "But Thaddeus, there's something you should know. If this works, if Hannah regains lucidity, the memories may be traumatic. What was done to her—" "I'll be here," he said simply. "Whatever she remembers, she won't face it alone." Laurel nodded, understanding that his words applied not just to Hannah, but to herself as well. Whatever she discovered in Providence Valley, whatever truths awaited her there, she would not face them alone. The realization brought an unexpected comfort, a warmth that lingered even as she focused on the clinical task of preparing the treatment. From Edwin's notes, she measured precise drops of the amber compound into a solution of distilled water and herbal extracts. The familiar routine of medical preparation steadied her hands, centered her thoughts. When the mixture was ready, Laurel filled a small syringe, its needle gleaming in the lamplight. She turned to find Thaddeus watching her, his expression a complex mixture of hope and apprehension. "It's ready," she said. He moved to Hannah's side, taking one of her limp hands in his. Laurel positioned herself on the opposite side of the bed, swabbing the inside of Hannah's elbow with alcohol. "Talk to her," Laurel instructed as she prepared to administer the injection. "Let her hear your voice. It may help guide her back." Thaddeus hesitated only briefly before beginning to speak, his deep voice gentle, in a way Laurel hadn't heard before. "Hannah, it's Uncle Thad. I'm here with you. We're at Shadow Creek, where you used to visit with your mother. Remember how you would ride dusk around the corral? How you begged me to teach you to shoot, and your mother was so angry with me when I did?" As he spoke, memories flowing into stories that painted a picture of the vibrant young woman Hannah had been. Laurel carefully inserted the needle into a vein. The amber fluid entered Hannah's bloodstream, a momentary intrusion that could change everything or nothing. For several minutes after the injection, there was no visible response. Hannah's breathing remained shallow and regular, her expression unchanged. Thaddeus continued talking his story spanning years: Hannah's first lost tooth, her determination to learn to read before starting school, her love of climbing trees that had nearly given Rebecca heart failure. Then so subtle Laurel almost missed it, a flicker of movement beneath Hannah's eyelids. Her breathing quickened slightly, and her fingers twitched in Thaddeus's grasp. Hannah, he leaned closer, hope sharpening his voice. The young woman's eyes opened, slowly unfocused at first, then gradually sharpening. She blinked, confusion evident in her expression as she took in her surroundings. Uncle Thad. Her voice was a rasp, worn thin from disuse. I'm here, he said, squeezing her hand gently. You're safe. Hannah struggled to sit up, panic flaring in her eyes as memories returned. They'll come for me. They always come. No one is coming, Thaddeus assured him. You're at Shadow Creek. You've been here for 3 months. 3 months, she looked to Laurel, wariness replacing panic. Who are you? This is Laurel Blackwood, Thaddeus explained. She's been helping care for you. Recognition dawned in Hannah's eyes. Dr. Blackwood's wife. You were in Providence Valley. You tried to help me. I did. Laurel moved closer, eager for any fragment of the memories she had lost. Hannah nodded, wincing at the movement. When they brought me in for treatments, you adjusted the straps so they wouldn't cut. Gave me water afterward. Her brow furrowed with effort. You asked questions about what they were doing, about the missing women. Missing women, Laurel exchanged a glance with Thaddeus. From Providence Valley. Young ones mostly. Unmarried. Hannah's voice strengthened as she spoke, memories returning in a rush. They said the girls ran away. But Sarah Jenkins wouldn't leave her little brother. Mary Cosgrove was engaged to be married. They didn't run away. They were taken for the special treatments. By Dr. Ward, Laurel guessed, and Elder Caldwell. They worked together. Hannah's gaze sharpened, focusing intently on Laurel. You figured it out. You found the records. That's why they came for you. The fragmented memories aligned Laurel in a small office, rifling through patient files by lamplight. A ledger listing names of women, dates of treatment, and cryptic notations about outcomes. Her growing horror as she realized what was happening. And then voices, a door opening, rough hands grabbing her. They tried to erase my memory, Laurel said softly, like they did with the others. Hannah nodded. But it didn't work right with you. You started remembering, asking questions again. So they took me to Desolation Valley instead. To die, Hannah confirmed. They said it was God's judgment, that you were a heretic who questioned divine authority. Her voice broke. They said the same about me when the treatments went wrong. That my mind was too corrupted to be saved. Thaddeus's expression darkened with barely contained fury. How did you escape? One of the guards, Jacob Miller. He has a sister my age. He helped me get out, gave me a horse. Hannah's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what happened to him after. Laurel absorbed this information, adding it to the fragmentary picture of Providence Valley and her time there. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional pop of the fire in the grate. Hannah, she finally said, choosing her words carefully. Dr. Ward, what did he look like? Hannah frowned, considering. Older. Gray at his temples, tall and thin with cold eyes. Always wore black like an undertaker. Not Edwin, then. Relief flooded Laurel, followed immediately by doubt. Edwin had been skilled at disguise during the war, adopting different personas as needed for his work. Could he have created this Gideon Ward identity? And you never saw anyone else working with him? Another doctor, perhaps? No. Hannah shook her head. Just Ward and Elder Caldwell. And the guards. She hesitated. But Ward talked about a partner sometimes. Someone who had started the research during the war. He said they were finishing important work together. The implication hung in the air, unspoken, but undeniable. If Edwin was alive, if he was continuing his research, he was connected to whatever was happening in Providence Valley, whether directly or indirectly. Laurel stood moving to the window that overlooked the snow-covered ranch. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the pristine landscape. So beautiful, so peaceful, a stark contrast to the darkness they had uncovered. We need to go to Providence Valley, she said, turning back to face Thaddeus and Hannah. To find Edwin, to stop whatever Ward and Caldwell are doing. Hannah's expression tightened with fear. They'll recognize you. Both of you. Not if we're careful, Thaddeus said. I've been watching Providence Valley for months. I know their routines, their vulnerabilities. And I know how to disappear in plain sight, Laurel added. It was part of my work during the war. Hannah studied them both, then nodded slowly. I want to help. I know the valley, the buildings. I know where they keep their records, where they perform the treatments. No, Thaddeus said firmly. You're staying here where it's safe. I can't just hide while you risk yourselves, Hannah protested. Not when I might be able to help. You've already helped, Laurel interjected gently. The information you have provided is invaluable. But your uncle is right. Providence Valley isn't safe for you. If they recaptured you, Hannah fell silent, the ghost of her ordeal visible in her eyes. After a moment, she nodded reluctantly. I'll stay, but promise me one thing. What? Thaddeus asked. Find out what happened to Jacob, the guard who helped me. He has a mother and sister who depend on him. We'll try, Laurel promised, in understanding the weight of debt, the obligation to those who risk themselves for others. Hannah settled back against the pillows, fatigue evident in the lines of her face. The treatment had worked perhaps too well, overwhelming her with the rush of returned memories and emotions. You should rest, Laurel said, moving to adjust the blankets around the young woman. The compound can be taxing on the body. Hannah caught her wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Be careful in Providence Valley, she warned. Ward isn't the only danger. There's something wrong there, something underneath it all that I never understood. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Something in the water and the soil. People who stay too long, they change. Laurel exchanged a glance with Thaddeus, uncertain how to interpret this warning. Was it a literal observation, or the lingering effect of trauma and experimental treatments? We'll be careful, she assured Hannah, gently disengaging from her grip. Now rest. You're safe here. Hannah's eyes were already drooping, the demanding work of healing and remembering drawing her towards sleep. Safe, she murmured, for now. The words lingered in the air like a prophecy, a shadow cast across their plans. Laurel busied herself checking Hannah's pulse and respiration, avoiding Thaddeus's gaze until the young woman had drifted into sleep. She's stable, Laurel finally said, straightening. The treatment worked better than I dared hope. But Thaddeus prompted, hearing the reservation in her voice. But her warning concerns me about something wrong in Providence Valley. Laurel moved away from the bed, keeping her voice low. It could be the lingering effects of the compound she was given. Paranoia is a common side effect of treatments that affect the brain. Or it could be accurate, Thaddeus countered. Providence Valley has always been different, isolated, self-contained, even before Elder Caldwell took leadership. Laurel nodded, considering. The treatments Edwin was developing, they required specific conditions, controlled environments. It would explain why he or Ward chose such an isolated community. All the more reason to proceed carefully. Thaddeus moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. We leave at first light. Eleanor will care for Hannah while we're gone. Does Eleanor know about Hannah's condition, about our plans? Some, not all. Thaddeus's expression softened when he spoke of his sister. Eleanor has suffered enough because of Providence Valley. I try to shield her from the worst of it. She's stronger than you give her credit for, Laurel observed. She survived the same loss you did. In a different way. He turned from the window. Eleanor lost a sister. I lost a sister and nearly lost a niece. And the responsibility for Rebecca's safety was mine. I'm the one who failed to prevent her marriage to Calvin Miller, despite knowing what kind of man he was. The admission appeared to cost him, revealing a vulnerability beneath the stoic exterior. Laurel recognized the burden of perceived failure of responsibility for others' suffering. She had carried similar weight during the war when patients died under her care despite her best efforts. We can't protect everyone, she said softly, not even those we love most. No, and his gaze met hers, acknowledgement of a shared truth. But we can seek justice for them and prevent others from suffering the same fate. In that moment, illuminated by moonlight and shared purpose, Thaddeus Kane was not just the man who had saved her from Desolation Valley. He was a fellow survivor, someone who understood the weight of the past and the cost of confronting it. Get some rest, he said, breaking the moment. Tomorrow will be challenging. Laurel nodded, gathering her medical supplies. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back at him. Thank you, she said, for trusting me with Hannah, with the truth. You trusted me first, he replied simply, with your life in Desolation Valley, even if you don't remember it. She smiled faintly. Perhaps some part of me does. Dawn broke clear and cold, the rising sun transforming the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of diamond-like brilliance. Laurel stood on the porch, breathing in the crisp air, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Eleanor emerged from the house carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Provisions, she explained, handing it to Laurel. Bread, cheese, dried meat, enough for 3 days. Thank you. Laurel secured the bundle to her saddlebag, noting the older woman's tight expression. Thaddeus told you our destination. Providence Valley. Eleanor's mouth twisted with distaste. That place has brought nothing but sorrow to this family. We're going to find answers, Laurel assured her, about Rebecca, about what's happening there. Just come back, Eleanor said simply, both of you. Before Laurel could respond, Thaddeus emerged from the stables leading 2 saddled horses, Dusk and a smaller chestnut mare. Maple is steady and sure-footed, he told Laurel, handing her the mare's reins. She'll serve you well in rough terrain. Laurel stroked the horse's velvet nose, receiving a gentle nudge in return. She's beautiful. She was Rebecca's, Eleanor said softly. She would be pleased to know you're riding her. The statement carried a weight of acceptance of inclusion in their family's ongoing story. Laurel felt its significance as she mounted the mare, settling into the saddle that had once held Rebecca Kane. Thaddeus secured his rifle to his saddle and checked the revolver at his hip. Laurel had her own smaller pistol, a concession to necessity rather than preference. As a nurse, she had taken an oath to heal, not harm. But Providence Valley had demonstrated that principles sometimes needed to bend in the face of survival. Stay alert on the North Ridge, Marcus advised as he handed Thaddeus a map. Saw tracks there yesterday. Might be nothing but. We'll be careful, Thaddeus assured him, folding the map into his coat. To Eleanor, he added, if we're not back in 3 days. I know what to do, she interrupted. But you'll be back. The certainty in her voice seemed to be as much command as prediction. Thaddeus nodded, accepting both. With final farewells, they rode out, heading east toward the mountains that separated Shadow Creek from Providence Valley. The terrain was challenging, snow-covered trails winding through dense pine forests and rocky outcroppings. But both horses were sure-footed, and Thaddeus knew the land intimately. They rode in companionable silence for the first hour, each lost in thought. Laurel found herself watching Thaddeus, the straight set of his shoulders, the alertness in his posture. He rode as if born to it, one with his horse in a way that spoke of years in the saddle. As the sun climbed higher, they paused at a small clearing to rest the horses. Thaddeus produced a map, spreading it on a fallen log. Providence Valley lies here, he said, pointing to a depression surrounded by higher terrain. There's a main road in from the south, but it's watched. We'll approach from the west through Miller's Pass. Is it guarded? Not usually. It's steep, difficult. Most consider it impassable in winter. But not you, Laurel observed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I've made a study of Providence Valley's vulnerabilities over the past year. There are ways in and out that even Elder Caldwell doesn't know about. Since Rebecca's death, Laurel guessed. Yes, his expression sobered. When they returned her body to us, they called it an accident, a fall down stairs. But Rebecca had navigated those same stairs since childhood. She didn't fall. You think she was murdered? I know she was. His certainty was absolute. The question is why? What did she discover that made her dangerous to them? Laurel considered what they knew: Providence Valley, a secretive religious community. Edwin's research continued under the guise of Gideon Ward. Experimental treatments designed to control memory and, by extension, behavior. Missing women selected for special treatments. What if Rebecca found out about the experiments? She suggested. About the missing women. It's possible. Rebecca was observant, intelligent. If people were disappearing, she would have noticed. Thaddeus refolded the map, his movements precise. Calvin, her husband, was close to Elder Caldwell. He could have been involved. And Hannah, how did she become a subject for these treatments? I'm not sure. His brow furrowed. After Rebecca's death, Calvin retained custody, as was his right under law. Hannah wrote to us occasionally, but the letters were controlled, supervised. Then they stopped altogether about 6 months ago. Around the time the treatments would have started based on Edwin's notebook, Laurel noted. Yes. And they remounted and continued their journey, the terrain growing steeper as they approached the mountains. Laurel found herself grateful for Maple's steady gait, for the mare's seemingly intuitive understanding of where to place each hoof on the precarious trail. By midday, they had reached a high ridge overlooking a narrow pass. Below, partially obscured by pine trees, lay a valley surrounded by mountains on three sides. From this distance, Providence Valley appeared idyllic, a cluster of neat buildings surrounding a white church fields lying dormant under winter snow, thin ribbons of smoke rising from chimneys. "It looks so peaceful," Laurel murmured. "Appearances can be deceiving." Thaddeus dismounted, helping Laurel down from her horse. "We'll rest here, continue on foot through the pass after dark." They secured the horses in a sheltered grove, then settled beneath a large pine to share Eleanor's provisions. The bread was still warm, wrapped in cloth that had held the heat, and the cheese sharp and flavorful. "Tell me about Rebecca," Laurel said as they ate. "What was she like?" Thaddeus was silent for a moment, his gaze distant. "Stubborn," he finally said, a fond smile softening his features. "Determined. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them." You see, the smile faded. "That's what makes her marriage to Calvin Miller so difficult to understand. She wasn't the type to surrender her will to anyone. Could she have been coerced, threatened? Perhaps." He took a sip from his canteen. "Or perhaps she saw something in him that the rest of us missed. Rebecca always believed she could change people, help them become their best selves." "A dangerous belief," Laurel observed. "People rarely change unless they want to." "A lesson she learned too late, I fear." Thaddeus looked out over the valley. The Millers were founding members of Providence Valley. Calvin's father helped establish the community 30 years ago. They held influence, respect. He paused. And secrets, apparently. Laurel followed his gaze, studying the peaceful-seeming settlement below. How many other women had disappeared into that valley, never to emerge? How many had been subjected to Edwin's treatments? Their memories and wills systematically eroded. "If Edwin is there," she said slowly, "if he's part of this, I need to know why. What happened to change him from the man I married to someone who would participate in this? And if there is no satisfactory answer," Thaddeus asked, "if he has simply chosen a darker path, then I'll do what's necessary to stop him." The conviction in her voice surprised even Laurel. "Whatever Edwin and I once shared, it doesn't justify harming innocent women. It doesn't excuse what was done to Hannah or to me." Thaddeus studied her, his expression thoughtful. "You're not what I expected, Laurel Blackwood. What did you expect?" "Someone more broken by what happened to you. Providence Valley has destroyed stronger people than many I've known." "I was broken," she admitted. "Perhaps I still am in ways I'm only beginning to understand. But being broken doesn't mean being defeated." He nodded acknowledgement of a truth they both understood. Whatever wounds they carried from war, from loss, from betrayal, they had survived. They had rebuilt themselves around the damage, found purpose in the aftermath of destruction. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, Thaddeus repacked their supplies. "We should move closer to the pass before dark. There's a hunter's cabin about an hour from here where we can wait until nightfall." They led the horses carefully down the ridge, following a trail so faint that Laurel would have missed it without Thaddeus's guidance. The forest grew denser, the pines towering overhead like silent sentinels. "You know this area well," Laurel observed as Thaddeus navigated a particularly challenging section of trail. "I grew up in these mountains," he replied. "My father was a trapper before he established Shadow Creek Ranch. He taught me every pass, every hidden valley." A hint of pride colored his voice. "Knowledge that served me well during the war." "You were a scout?" "Among other things." He glanced back at her. "As were you, it seems." Laurel smiled faintly. "Not officially, but nurses heard things, saw things. Information that sometimes found its way to the right officers. A dangerous game. As was yours, I imagine." Their shared understanding of risk, of operating in hostile territory, created a connection deeper than words. For all their difference, Union and Confederate nurse and soldier, they had both navigated the moral complexities of war, made choices that others might not understand. The hunter's cabin appeared just as dusk began to settle over the forest, a small, sturdy structure built of logs and nearly invisible among the surrounding pines. Inside was sparse but serviceable, a rough-hewn table, a few stools, a stone fireplace, and a narrow cot. Thaddeus checked the cabin's perimeter, while Laurel tended to the horses, settling them in a small lean-to at the rear. By the time they had both returned inside, full darkness had fallen. "We'll wait 2 hours," Thaddeus said, lighting a small oil lamp. that cast warm golden light around the cabin. Providence Valley has a curfew. By then, most will be in their homes. Laurel nodded, removing her gloves and warming her hands by the small fire Thaddeus had started. What's our plan once we reach the valley? There's an abandoned barn at the western edge of the settlement. We'll establish a base there, observe for a day to confirm routines haven't changed. He spread his map on the table, pointing to various locations. The church where Elder Caldwell resides. The meeting hall where most community gatherings occur. And here, separated from the main settlement, what they call the healing house, where the treatments are administered, Laurel guessed. Yes, according to Hannah, that's where Dr. Ward works, where the women are taken. Laurel studied the map, memorizing the layout of Providence Valley. And our primary objective, information, Thaddeus said firmly, about Rebecca's death, about these experiments, about the missing women. We observe, we gather what we can, and we leave. This isn't a rescue mission or a confrontation. Not yet, his tone implied, but perhaps soon. Laurel agreed with the approach. They needed to understand what they were facing before taking direct action. Still part of her, the nurse who had sworn to do no harm to relieve suffering, where she found it, rebelled at the thought of observing injustice without intervening. And if we find women being held there, she asked, being subjected to these treatments against their will? Thaddeus was silent for a moment, weighing principles against pragmatism. We assess the situation, he finally said. If there's an opportunity to help without compromising our primary mission, we take it. But understand this, Laurel, Providence Valley is dangerous. One misstep could mean both our lives, and then we help no one. She nodded, accepting the wisdom in his caution. Agreed. They fell into companionable silence, each preparing in their own way for the night ahead. Laurel checked her pistol, ensuring it was loaded and functioning properly. Thaddeus meticulously inspected his larger weapons, then set about crafting something from supplies in his pack. What are you making? Laurel asked, curiosity overcoming her contemplation. Disguises of a sort. He held up what appeared to be a false beard. Providence Valley men maintained specific appearances. Full beards for married men, trimmed for the unmarried. Women with covered hair, high collars. He passed her a bundle of fabric. This should help you blend in. Laurel unfurled the bundle to find a plain dress in the Providence Valley-style, high-necked, long-sleeved, severe in its simplicity. With it was a bonnet designed to cover most of the hair and frame the face in a way that cast shadows over distinguishing features. You've planned this for some time, she observed. Since Hannah arrived at Shadow Creek, he confirmed, I've been gathering information, preparing for the right moment. He met her gaze directly. Your arrival accelerated my timeline, but the plan was always to infiltrate Providence Valley, to find the truth about Rebecca. Laurel understood then that while her quest for answers about Edwin and her own lost memories had brought her to this moment, Thaddeus had been on his own parallel journey of discovery and justice. Their paths had converged, their separate searches becoming a shared mission. For Rebecca, she acknowledged. For Rebecca, he echoed. For Hannah, for you, and for all the others who may have suffered in that valley. The simple declaration held the weight of promise, of commitment to something larger than personal vengeance or closure. It spoke to the core of who Thaddeus Kane was, a man of principle, driven by a need to right wrongs even at great personal risk. In that moment, illuminated by lamplight, in a hunter's cabin on the edge of danger, Laurel recognized something in him that resonated with her own nature. Not just shared purpose or complementary skills, but a fundamental alignment of values. A recognition that some battles must be fought, some truths uncovered, regardless of the cost. As they prepared to enter Providence Valley to confront the shadows of their respective pasts, Laurel felt a curious sense of rightness. Whatever lay ahead, whatever revelations about Edwin, about herself, about the darkness at the heart of that isolated community, she would face it alongside someone who understood the importance of truth, of justice, of reckoning. The hour grew late, the time for departure approaching. Outside, the forest stood silent under stars and moon, the snow reflecting enough light to navigate by. Soon they would leave the relative safety of the cabin, descend into a valley of secrets and dangers. But for now, in this moment of calm before action, Laurel allowed herself to acknowledge a truth she had been avoiding somewhere along this journey of rediscovery. Amidst the fragments of her returning memory and the shadows of her past, she had begun to care for Thaddeus Kane in a way that transcended gratitude or alliance. A dangerous realization, perhaps, given the uncertainties that lay ahead, but also a source of strength. A reminder that even in the darkest valleys, light could be found in purpose, in justice, and sometimes unexpectedly, in the connection between two souls who had seen similar shadows and survived. Providence Valley after nightfall was a study in contrasts, neat orderly buildings shrouded in darkness, the white church spire gleaming under moonlight like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. From their vantage point at the edge of the tree line, Laurel and Thaddeus observed the settlement in silence. Most buildings were dark, observing the community's strict curfew. Only the church and a larger structure set apart from the others, the healing house, showed signs of activity, faint lamplight glimmering behind curtained windows. "We'll approach from the west," Thaddeus whispered, adjusting the false beard that transformed his appearance. "Stay in the shadows, move only when I signal." Laurel nodded, tugging the bonnet lower to obscure her face. The plain dress felt constricting after the relative freedom of Eleanor's borrowed clothing, the high collar-like hands around her throat. But the discomfort was a small price for anonymity. They moved in silence, two shadows among many, in a landscape of moonlight and snow. The abandoned barn Thaddeus had identified stood like a weathered sentinel at the settlement's edge, its sagging roof and cracked boards telling a story of neglect. Inside the barn smelled of old hay and earth, the floorboards groaning softly beneath their weight. Thaddeus secured the door while Laurel lit a small, shielded lantern that cast just enough light to see by without risking detection from outside. "We'll rest here until dawn," Thaddeus said, keeping his voice low. "Then observe the morning routines, gather information." Laurel nodded, settling on a pile of musty hay. Despite the physical discomfort, exhaustion claimed her quickly, the day's journey catching up with her body, if not her mind. She dozed fitfully, waking at intervals to find Thaddeus still alert, watching through cracks in the barn walls. Before dawn, she woke fully to his hand on her shoulder. "Movement at the healing house," he murmured, guiding her to a vantage point. Through a knothole in the aged wood, Laurel could see the building Hannah had described. In the pre-dawn gloom, a tall, thin figure emerged, a man dressed in black, his bearing formal and precise, even at this early hour. He was joined by a younger man who handed him what appeared to be a medical bag. "Dr. Ward," Laurel whispered, studying the older man's profile. He matched Hannah's description, silver at the temples, austere features, movements economical and controlled. "And Isaiah Caldwell," Thaddeus added, indicating the younger man. "Elder Caldwell's son, the one you refused to marry." Laurel felt a visceral reaction to the name, at a tightening in her chest that suggested her body remembered what her mind still struggled to recall. She watched Isaiah, his sharp features, the proprietary way he carried himself, the cold efficiency of his movements. The two men conversed briefly before Ward departed, heading toward the church. Isaiah remained outside the healing house, lighting a pipe and scanning the surroundings with practiced vigilance. "A guard," Thaddeus observed. "Or a keeper," Laurel suggested, remembering Hannah's account of being held for treatments. They continued their observation as dawn broke over Providence Valley, illuminating a community coming methodically to life. Women emerged from houses headed to a communal kitchen. Men gathered for morning prayers at the church. Children were escorted to a small schoolhouse, walking in orderly lines under watchful supervision. "Everything is structured," Laurel noted, "controlled. The perfect environment for experiments in compliance and control," Thaddeus agreed grimly. By mid-morning, they had established the basic patterns of the community prayer services, work rotations, mealtimes. The healing house remained a focal point of interest, with people entering and leaving at scheduled intervals, always under Isaiah's watchful eye. "I need to get closer," Laurel decided as they observed a young woman being escorted into the building. "See what's happening inside." "Too risky in daylight," Thaddeus cautioned. "We'll move after dark." But Providence Valley had other plans. As midday approached, activity centered on the church where a bell began to toll. Community members emerged from their various tasks, forming an orderly procession toward the white building. Special service, Thaddeus guessed, not on their usual schedule. Through the barn's cracks, they watched as the entire community, perhaps 100 people in total, filed into the church. Only Isaiah remained outside, still stationed at the healing house. "This is our opportunity," Laurel said. "With everyone at the service, we can access the healing house records." Thaddeus hesitated, weighing the unexpected opening against their original plan. "Isaiah is still there," he pointed out. "One man versus the entire community later," Laurel countered. "And I recognize the pattern from Edwin's work during the war. The treatments are likely administered on a precise schedule. If we wait, we risk interrupting an active procedure." After a brief silence, Thaddeus nodded. We'll approach from the north side, use the delivery entrance Hannah mentioned. But at the first sign of danger, we retreat. Agreed. Agreed. They slipped from the barn, keeping to the shadows of buildings in the cover of bare trees. The healing house grew larger as they approached a substantial structure of red brick, more institutional than the homely wooden buildings that comprised most of the settlement. The delivery entrance was as Hannah had described, a small door at the rear, partially concealed by overgrown shrubs. Thaddeus tested the handle, finding it locked. "Allow me," Laurel murmured, withdrawing a set of thin metal tools from her pocket. At Thaddeus's raised eyebrow, she added, "Field hospitals during the war were often locked. Soldiers in pain sometimes sought more laudanum than was safe." Her fingers moved with practiced precision, manipulating the lock's mechanism. After a tense minute, it yielded with a soft click. Thaddeus drew his revolver, nodded once, and they slipped inside. The corridor beyond was dimly lit by gas lamps, its walls institutional, green floors polished wood. The air carried antiseptic scents familiar to Laurel from field hospitals: carbolic acid, ether, medicinal herbs. But beneath these clinical odors lurked something else, something that triggered an instinctive recoil, a sweetish undertone reminiscent of putrefaction. "This way," she whispered, following her medical instincts toward what felt like the heart of the facility. They passed rooms with closed doors, some marked with names, others with numbers. From behind one, Laurel heard quiet weeping. From another, a monotonous murmuring, the same phrases repeated endlessly like a damaged music box. At the corridor's end stood a larger door marked simply "Records." Laurel tried the handle, locked, but yielding to her tools after a brief struggle. The records room beyond was meticulously organized filing cabinets along one wall, a large desk in the center, and bookshelves filled with medical text, many of the titles Laurel recognized from Edwin's personal library. "Search for Rebecca's name," she instructed Thaddeus, moving to the filing cabinets. "I'll look for treatment records." They worked quickly, efficiently, the silence broken only by the rustle of papers and the distant sounds of the church service. Laurel found a cabinet labeled "Protocols," containing detailed descriptions of the treatments administered at the healing house. The documents confirmed her worst fears: experimental procedures designed to control memory and behavior using compounds derived from Edwin's original research, but refined, made more potent. Subject listings included ages, conditions, and clinical notations about responsiveness and compliance levels. One file labeled "Special Cases" contained familiar names: Hannah Miller listed as non-responsive, terminated from program, and Laurel Blackwood designated as initially resistant, potential for full compliance, questionable, recommended for removal. "Removal," she whispered, the clinical euphemism for her intended death in Desolation Valley. "Laurel," Thaddeus's voice drew her attention. He stood at the desk, a leather-bound journal open before him. "I found Rebecca's file." She joined him, reading over his shoulder. The entries chronicled Rebecca Kane Miller's treatment course: initial resistance, followed by increasing compliance as the procedures continued. The final entry, dated 3 years earlier, was brutally direct. Subject exhibited unexpected memory recovery during Procedure 17. Questioned protocols and attempted to access restricted records. Compliance reversal, complete and irreversible. Termination authorized by Elder Caldwell, executed by C. Miller. "Calvin killed her," Thaddeus said, his voice hollow with the confirmation of his worst suspicions. "Her own husband." Laurel placed a hand on his arm, feeling the tension of controlled rage beneath his sleeve. She remembered, like Hannah did, like I did. The treatments aren't always permanent, which makes the subjects dangerous. Thaddeus concluded carefully, photographing the page with the small camera he'd brought. "Threats to be eliminated rather than controlled." "Yes. But why?" Laurel gestured to the extensive records. "What purpose does all this serve? Why develop methods to control memory and behavior in a community already isolated and indoctrinated?" Before Thaddeus could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, purposeful, approaching. They froze, exchanging a silent look of alarm. The footsteps paused outside the records room door, a key scratched in the lock. Thaddeus motioned Laurel toward a large cabinet that offered their only chance of concealment. They slipped behind it just as the door opened, barely hidden from immediate view. Through the narrow gap between cabinet and wall, Laurel could see Dr. Ward enter, followed by Elder Caldwell, a heavy-set man with a patriarchal beard and cold, assessing eyes. They were deep in conversation, unaware of the intruders concealed mere feet away. The preparations are complete, Ward was saying, his voice cultured, precise. Tonight's procedure will be the culmination of our work here. The women are ready, Caldwell asked, moving to the desk where Rebecca's file still lay open. 5 subjects, all showing optimal compliance levels. Ward seemed to notice the open file, frowning slightly. Was someone in here, Isaiah perhaps? Caldwell suggested closing the file and returning it to a drawer. He's been sentimental about Rebecca Miller lately. Still harbors guilt. Sentimentality is weakness, Ward dismissed. The work requires clarity of purpose, unwavering commitment, which you have always provided, Doctor. Caldwell's tone held deference unusual for a man of his authority, even when others wavered. Edwin's hesitation was predictable, Ward said dismissively. He was always torn between scientific progress and outdated ethical constraints. A brilliant mind, but limited by conventional morality. Laurel tensed at the mention of Edwin's name, feeling Thaddeus's hand on her arm, a silent warning to remain still, though her every instinct cried out for answers. Will he attend tonight's procedure? Caldwell inquired. No. Ward's expression hardened. Dr. Blackwood has served his purpose. The final phase requires a steadier hand than his. The confirmation hit Laurel like a physical blow. Edwin was alive. He was here in Providence Valley involved in these experiments. She had been right to question the story of his death, right to sense something amiss in the narrative she'd been given. And afterward, Caldwell pressed, the expansion to other communities. As planned. Ward moved to a large map on the wall, one Laurel couldn't see clearly from her hiding place. The compounds are stable transportable. With proper distribution through water supplies, entire towns can be pacified, made receptive to guidance. The implication was staggering mass control manipulation on a scale far beyond this isolated valley. Not just an experiment in social compliance, but a prototype for something much larger. Providence Valley will be remembered as the birthplace of a new era. Caldwell intoned satisfaction evident in his voice. A world of perfect order, perfect obedience to divine law, as God intended. Indeed, Ward's agreement carried a note of something like amusement quickly concealed. Now we should return to the service. The announcement of tonight's special procedure should be made with appropriate spiritual framing. The 2 men departed, their footsteps receding down the corridor. In their wake, Laurel and Thaddeus emerged from concealment, exchanging looks of shared horror. They're planning to expand beyond Providence Valley, Laurel whispered, to contaminate water supplies with Edwin's compounds. Mass control, Thaddeus confirmed grimly, using religion as the justification and cover. We need to find Edwin, Laurel decided. He knows the compounds, how they work, how they might be neutralized. And if he's fully committed to this plan, if he's as corrupt as Ward, then I'll deal with that reality when I face it. Laurel's voice hardened with resolve. But Ward mentioned hesitation, ethical concerns. There might still be something of the Edwin I knew, something I can appeal to. Thaddeus studied her for a moment, then nodded once. We'll search for him, but first we need to document everything. He gestured to the records, evidence of what they're planning. They worked quickly, Thaddeus photographing key documents, while Laurel searched for information on the final procedure planned for that night. She found it in a secure drawer, detailed protocols for administering the perfected compound to 5 women selected as progenitors. They're planning to create a generation of children born to mothers already under chemical control, she realized, scanning the document with growing horror. The compounds cross the placental barrier. The children would be born compliant. A new kind of slavery, Thaddeus said, his expression darkening. Generations born into chemical servitude, never knowing freedom of thought or will. The scope of the violation was almost too vast to comprehend, not just the women currently subjected to these treatments, but their children and their children's children. A lineage of enforced compliance cloaked in religious authority and scientific precision. We have to stop tonight's procedure, Laurel declared, and destroy their research, their compounds. Agreed. But how the entire community will be involved? Ward and Caldwell won't leave anything to chance. Laurel considered their limited options, the overwhelming odds. Then her medical training asserted itself, reminding her that every compound had vulnerabilities. Every biological system could be disrupted. The stabilizing agent, she said suddenly, the one I used on Hannah. If I can reproduce it in sufficient quantities, introduce it to the women scheduled for tonight's procedure, It could reverse the conditioning, Thaddeus finished. Like it did for Hannah. Exactly, but I need equipment and ingredients. She glanced around the records room, and I need to know where they're keeping the women. The basement, a voice said from the doorway. They spun toward the sound, Thaddeus raising his revolver in one fluid motion. A young man stood there, perhaps 25, with a guard's uniform, but kind eyes at odds with his role. Jacob Miller. Thaddeus identified, not lowering his weapon. Hannah spoke of you. She made it to you then, Jacob said, relief evident in his voice. Thank God. I've been worried. She's safe, Laurel assured him, studying his face for signs of deception and finding none. She asked us to find you. There's no time for that now, Jacob said urgently. The service is ending. Soon they will be back. The women are in the basement, 5 of them, including my sister Sarah. Tonight's procedure. He swallowed hard. It's a death sentence dressed as an honor. None of the previous subjects survived the full treatment. How do we reach the basement? Thaddeus demanded, lowering his gun slightly, but remaining wary. I'll show you. Jacob glanced nervously down the corridor. But we must hurry, and you'll need these. He handed Laurel a ring of keys. For the treatment room, the medicine cabinet. I've been stealing keys and making wax impressions for months preparing. Why help us? Laurel asked, even as she accepted the keys. Because this place isn't what I thought it was, Jacob said simply. Because what they're doing is wrong. And because Hannah Miller showed me what courage looks like. With that, he led them deeper into the healing house, down service stairs to a basement level, not reflected in the building's external appearance. The air grew colder, damper, the antiseptic smell giving way to something earthier, the scent of soil, of roots of things growing in darkness. The women are through there, Jacob indicated a heavy door at the corridor's end. Sedated, but they'll wake with stimulants. The treatment room is adjacent, that's where they prepare the compounds. What about guards? Thaddeus asked, assessing their tactical situation. Just me until sundown, then Isaiah returns with Ward. Jacob handed Thaddeus a folded paper. This is a map of the building, including exits. There's a tunnel from the treatment room that leads beyond the settlement's boundaries. It was built as an emergency evacuation route, but few know about it. And Edwin Blackwood? Laurel asked. DeWard mentioned him. Where is he? Jacob's expression registered surprise. The cabin at the north edge of the valley. He rarely leaves it now, not since he tried to stop the procedures and Ward had him treated. His gaze lingered on Laurel. You're her, aren't you? His wife. He speaks of you sometimes when the treatments wear off. Laurel's heart contracted painfully. He was treated with his own compounds. Yes, when he objected to using children in the experiments. Ward said it was fitting the creator experiencing his creation. Jacob's expression was sympathetic. He has moments of clarity like Hannah did. That's when he speaks of you. The revelation shifted everything. Edwin, not as a willing participant, but another victim controlled by the very methods he had pioneered. It explained his absence from the records room, from the procedures. Ward had neutralized him, used his research while keeping him as a living resource to be tapped when needed. We need to split up, Laurel decided. Thaddeus, you and Jacob free the women, get them to safety through the tunnel. I'll gather what I need from the treatment room, then find Edwin. Too dangerous, Thaddeus objected. We stay together. There's no time, she insisted. The service is ending. People will be returning. We can accomplish more separately. Before he could argue further, the distant sound of the church doors opening reached them, the congregation dispersing, the community returning to its ordered routines. Go, Jacob urged. I'll show you the treatment room first, then help with the women. Laurel met Thaddeus's gaze, seeing the conflict in their tactical assessment warring with a concern for her safety. I'll find Edwin, get answers about neutralizing the compounds, and meet you beyond the settlement's boundary, she promised. Trust me, Thaddeus. Please. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded once. 2 hours. If you're not at the rendezvous point, I'm coming back for you. I wouldn't expect anything less. The treatment room was a laboratory that would have impressed even the most advanced medical facilities of the day, gleaming equipment, organized workstations, neatly labeled compounds. Laurel moved through it with practiced efficiency, recognizing Edwin's methodical approach to research in the arrangement. She gathered what she needed, the base elements for the stabilizing agent containers to transport them, notes that detailed the latest formulations. Working quickly, she combined ingredients for a neutralizing compound, one that might counteract the effects of tonight's planned procedure if administered in time. Hurry, Jacob urged from the doorway. I can hear movement upstairs. Laurel corked the last vial, securing it in a small case she'd found. Go with Thaddeus now. Get the women out. I'll find my own way. Jacob hesitated, then handed her a small key. For Edwin's cabin, there's a lock on the outside. The implication that Edwin was not just treated but imprisoned added yet another layer to the evolving tragedy. Laurel nodded her thanks, and Jacob departed to join Thaddeus in freeing the captive women. Alone in the treatment room, surrounded by the instruments of Edwin's corrupted vision, Laurel felt a momentary vertigo, the past and present colliding memories surfacing of Edwin in their Philadelphia apartment, working late into the night, his enthusiasm for science untainted by what it would become. Had the seeds of this been present even then? Had she missed signs of moral compromise, of boundaries that he was willing to cross? Or had the war changed him as it had changed so many revealing aspects of character, previously hidden even from themselves? She had no time to explore these questions. Gathering her supplies and Jacob's map, she located the tunnel entrance concealed behind a storage cabinet just as he had indicated. The passage beyond was narrow but navigable, illuminated at intervals by gas lamps that cast just enough light to see by. The air grew colder as she progressed, the walls transitioning from finished brick to rough-hewn stone to packed earth reinforced with timber. The tunnel angled upward, eventually ending at a trapdoor that opened into a small shed at the valley's northern edge. From there, Edwin's cabin was visible, a modest structure set apart from the main settlement, smoke rising from its chimney, suggesting occupation despite the appearance of abandonment. Laurel approached cautiously, aware that Ward might have placed guards or monitoring systems. But the cabin stood isolated, its single window casting warm light into the gathering dusk. At the door, she hesitated, key in hand. What version of Edwin would she find inside the brilliant, dedicated doctor she had married? The compromised scientist who had developed memory-controlling compounds? Or something between a man fractured by his own creation, trapped between lucidity and compliance? Taking a steadying breath, Laurel inserted the key and turned it. The lock yielded with a soft click, and she pushed the door open, stepping into the warmth beyond. The cabin's interior was Spartan but comfortable. A table strewn with papers and books, a small bed, a wood stove radiating heat. And seated by the window, gazing out at the darkening valley, was a man she had thought dead for years. Edwin Blackwood had aged beyond the passage of time, his once dark hair now mostly gray, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth, his tall frame slightly stooped. But when he turned at the sound of the door, his eyes, those intelligent, questioning eyes that had first drawn her to him, were unchanged. Laurel, his voice was a whispered disbelief and hope mingling in that single word. Edwin. She closed the door behind her, letting the supplies rest against it. You're alive. He stood slowly, as if unsure his legs would support him. They told me you were dead, that you'd been lost in Desolation Valley during the storm. His gaze sharpened, focusing with visible effort. But that wasn't true. None of it was true. No, she confirmed, keeping her distance, assessing his mental state. They tried to kill me, but I survived. Ward. Edwin's expression hardened at the name. He's corrupted everything. My research, my purpose. He gestured to the papers on the table. I've been trying to develop a counter-agent, something to neutralize the compounds permanently. But my mind, it comes and goes. The treatments. I know, Laurel said gently. Hannah told us. Jacob too. Hannah escaped. A flash of genuine joy crossed his features. Good. She was too bright, too independent for this place, like you. Edwin, I need to understand. Laurel took a careful step forward. Your research during the war was meant to help soldiers with trauma, with battlefield injuries. How did it become this? He sank back into his chair, the brief energy fading. It started with good intentions. Always does, doesn't it? But the military saw other applications. Control rather than healing. When I